Welcome to the first session in our summer series called Adult Vacation Bible Study that we do at St. John's every year. This year, we're focusing in particular on the stories of Samuel and 2 Samuel with the story of David as king. And so we're calling this series Reading David in 2 Samuel. But before we do that, we want to begin with an introduction in order to sort of set these stories in the biblical context and to provide some background. What you are seeing right now is actually a re-recording of a PowerPoint presentation that was done at St. John's this past Sunday, but due to technical difficulties, we are having to re-record it again. After the PowerPoint, you'll then be invited into an ongoing session that happened this past Sunday at St. John's, which was a conversation and a deep dive into one of the texts at the beginning of 2 Samuel. So we're pleased that you're with us. We hope that you'll be with us throughout this series. We have a lineup of some great scholars to be with us over the course of the next several weeks. So thank you for joining us. And let's jump into our background and our orientation into 2 Samuel. As I noted, this is about reading David in 2 Samuel, and we're calling it the man God exalted. That is a quote from the very end of 2 Samuel. But we hear early on in the story of David that he is a man after God's own heart. If you notice the sculpture that's on the left, this is the most famous, perhaps, sculpture of David in Western art. The famous sculpture of David by Michelangelo, done in the Renaissance. It's in Florence. But throughout history, David has played an important role. He was sort of the image of what a king should be in ancient Israel. And Israel continued to look back to the time of David and to the house of David as the source of their kingship. And Jesus himself in the New Testament is understood as the son of David and of the line in the lineage of David. Especially we see that in for example, St. Matthew's Gospel. So David is amazing figure, enigmatic. On the one hand, he is the apple of God's eye, chosen by God to be king of Israel from among the sheepfolds, a little boy shepherd, the eighth son of a family. He shouldn't have amounted to anything, but he rises throughout the course of the story to become the greatest king of Israel. And then towards the other end of the story, is defeated in old age. Well, not defeated, I suppose, but in old age, he loses all the vigor of his youth, and we see him at the end of the story as an old man who has very little power left. So we can move on to the next slide. And we want to situate the books of Samuel in their context in the Bible, because the book before Samuel, called Judges, and the books after Samuel, books of Kings, demonstrate a transition in the political and cultural life of Israel. Now, of course, sandwiched between Judges and Samuel is the little book of Ruth, but Judges is the story of what Israel was like in its early times after the people entered the land of Canaan. You will remember that Israel had been slaves, the people of Israel had been slaves in Egypt. By the power of God, were freed, and under the leadership of Moses, wander 40 years in the wilderness, and then ultimately under the leadership of Joshua, enter into the land that they were promised, the land of Canaan. The book of Judges is the period before kingship. So Israel is politically unstable during this time. It's ruled by tribal elders, and at certain times in the history of the people, a leader will rise up to take control and to bring people back under the authority of the Lord. And when the people repent and turn back to the way of the Lord, they are blessed, and that judge succeeds. Those leaders are called judges. The most notable, of course, is Deborah, also one of the most successful judges or leaders in the book of Judges. There is no central authority. There is no king in Israel during this time. There are lots of independent tribal leaders. There are multiple religious centers, not just one religious center. There is a lot of idolatry that goes on. People tend to worship the local gods and not the God of Israel, Yahweh. And so there's political instability. In the background is a people called the Philistines that you may have heard of. The Philistines are a powerful kingdom right on the border of Canaan, and there is a fear that the Philistine authority, the Philistine power is going to come into Canaan and pick off each of these tribal centers and gain authority over it. So there is a need, the people feel, for a king. And so the books of Samuel form a transition point, the emergence of the monarchy in Israel. But Samuel, and according to the story of 1 Samuel, God is not interested in having a monarchy. They warn the people against what it means to have a king. And I will quote from the 8th chapter of the book of 1 Samuel. Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them." So according to the perspective of 1 Samuel, despite the political problems with not having a king, Samuel and the Lord both believe that God should be the king over Israel, and that they should not have a human monarch. And so continuing, just as they have done to me from the day I brought them out of the land of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so also they are doing to you. Now then, listen to their voice, only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. And so a monarchy, according to Samuel and to God, is going to bring the people of Israel lots of problems. So Samuel reported all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. And he said, "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50. And some will plow his ground and reap his harvest, to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He will take your daughters to be performers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to the courtiers. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and his courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves and the best of your cattle and donkeys and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves. But the Lord will not answer you in that day." But the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel. They said, "No, but we are determined to have a king over us, so that we also may be like other nations, and that our king may govern us and go out before us and fight our battles." When Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the ears of the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to their voice and set a king over them." Samuel then said to the people of Israel, "Each of you return to your home." And then at this point, the first king of Israel is chosen, and that is Saul. And so Samuel warns them that if they are going to have a king, they're not going to like it, but they insist on it. And so then we hear the story then of Samuel, and then of Saul, the first king, and then David. And David is the key player Samuel, Saul, and David are all key in this process of transformation, but David is clearly the key player in the books of Samuel. And it is his story from being as I said, a shepherd to becoming the most powerful king of Israel. But then after this transition time, the books of Kings show us the outcome of this centralized happen in Second Kings. We have we moved here. Here we go. Okay. We have centralized political power. There is a king. There is a city, Jerusalem, which becomes the capital of the country. There's economic monopoly, that the centralized government has control of the economy. The monarchy does have this divine sanction. For example, after David, Solomon becomes the Lord's anointed and is a successful king. But then also oppressive social relations, all the things that were predicted by the Lord and Samuel that will happen to the people if they have a king, are all the things that we find out happening later on in the monarchy. And the kings and the elites oppress the lower classes in the land of Israel, and things turn out to be just as Samuel had predicted. We can go to the next slide, please, Kelsey. So how does this transformation happen? Well, the books of Samuel tell us about that. And there are some factors that influence this transformation. And one of them is the social forces. We talked about the political power of the Philistines, threatening from the outside. The tribal powers and the infighting in the period of the judges are what caused people to want to have a king. And then increasing wealth in multiple power centers. That is, each of these tribal authorities is gaining their own wealth and their own power, and there are multiple centers. And so the idea of a king is to centralize that authority, to centralize the power, to centralize the wealth, and thus have a more powerful kingdom. But then the other thing that is at work, of course, in the books of Samuel is the personality of David himself. The early part of Samuel prepares for him. We don't hear about him in the first section of First Samuel, and then all of a sudden, when Saul no longer is an effective king, the Lord invites Samuel to anoint a new king in place of Saul, and that's the boy shepherd David, who is chosen from the sons of Jesse. All have to go before Samuel, and Samuel says, no, none of these folks are the right one. But then there's one child remaining to Jesse. He's out in the fields. He comes back in, and Samuel says, this is the one. And Samuel pours the horn of oil over his head and anoints him the king of Israel, while Saul is still on the throne. And this is the dramatic story of his call and then his rise to influence. And in 2 Samuel, how he himself becomes the king after Saul and his son Jonathan are killed in an epic battle on Mount Gilboa. So David is a charismatic leader around whom this whole narrative centers. David, of course, is not only the king, he's also a musician. You may know that many of the Psalms are attributed to David. And in fact, one of the first chapters of 2 Samuel, which is our focus in this class, is a song that David writes, a lament really for the death of Saul and his son Jonathan, whom David loved. But then there's a third character at work within the book of Samuel, bringing about this transformation from the period of the judges to the period of the monarchy. And that is the God of Israel himself. Yahweh, the God who led the people out of Egypt through the desert and into the promised land, plays a central role in this story. And he works primarily, at least at first, through the prophet Samuel. By the way, once we get into 2 Samuel, Samuel himself has already died towards the end of First Samuel, so we don't see Samuel active as a prophet through the kingship of David. There's another prophet that we'll encounter in this book called Nathan, but Samuel is already dead. And then Yahweh works through the events in the story in nearly miraculous ways. Of course, the most notable example is the way he blessed the kids of the Philistines, Goliath, and in an almost the Philistines is put to naught because of this one little boy who is able to vanquish him. The next slide, please, Kelsey. So then again, we thank Walter Brueggemann, who is a great Old Testament scholar, and his wonderful commentary on Samuel for all of this background mostly. And he invites us also to read Samuel in a particular way. And to avoid a couple of pitfalls as we read these texts. First of all, to avoid an overly religious reading, a pietistic reading. Allow the realism of the story to confront us. There are tensions and political fighting and violence and brutality that are all part of the story. And if we try to discount those or ignore them, we are ignoring a huge part of the story. If we're trying to do that for to pretty David up, to have an overly pious understanding of David. You know, when children have vacation Bible school, if they're going to read anything about David, they're going to read about maybe David being the boy who was a shepherd who gets anointed king, or maybe the story of David and Goliath, or maybe even the story of David dancing before the ark of the Lord. They may hear those stories, but we don't often talk about these also problematic texts that appear in the story, such as David spying on Bathsheba, who is the wife of one of his generals, Uriah, and takes her to have an affair with her, and she has no power in this situation. And David kills her husband. It's a very violent and problematic text, a text of terror, as the scholar Phyllis Tribble has talked about. So we want to avoid that sort of overly religious reading that tries to ignore all the problematic parts of the story. We also want to avoid an overly historical view that explains away the story of David or the influence of God in the story, in the human affairs of the story. An overly historical view would say, well, you know, the story of David as conveyed to us in the Bible, it really didn't happen this way. If we look at the archaeology, we don't even know if David actually even existed. All of that is fine as far as it goes, but it doesn't help us to read the books of First and Second Samuel, and the theological element of it, which is also important. And then so Brueggemann recommends that we read the story with attention to all three of these elements: the political and social realism that we need to bring to the text, the charismatic power of David, the presence of Yahweh acting through the narrative. All three of those things are elements in the story that we should pay attention to. And then an artistic reading, which allows us the power of the narrative as it is given to shape our understanding. How do these stories affect our understanding of power? How is God at work through these stories, if we can see God at work in them? And in our current and social political context, does the wisdom of these stories give us any insight into our own day and time, and how political power it affects societies and affects societies such as our own? And what can we learn from the wisdom of the stories of Samuel for our own time? And also with regard to the artistic reading, we want to focus on the whole story, allow it to be what it is. Don't try to domesticate the text. That is, there are lots of things in these stories that might make us uncomfortable, but those are part of the story. And so Brueggemann says the following, and if we can have the next slide, please. We may continue to expect surprises and can never say, now I know all about the text. So any book of the Bible, in particular the books of Samuel, the book of the Bible, is always going to be slippery. It's always going to get beyond us. We can't know all about any biblical text. It always is going to be wild. And if we try to domesticate it, we are not going to fully allow it to speak on its own terms. Can we go to the next slide then, please? So the books of Samuel, in terms of background, originally were understood as one book, that is the book of Samuel. And in the Hebrew Bible, that still is the case. The reason that we have in most of our Bibles two books of Samuel has to do with the translation of the book of Samuel into Greek. In Hebrew, Hebrew is a more economical language. It takes fewer words to say the same thing. And so when the books of Samuel were translated into Greek in the Septuagint version, they took up more scrolls. And so therefore we needed to have two scrolls of Samuel rather than one scroll of Samuel. But in the Hebrew tradition, the Jewish tradition, there's one book of Samuel, and we have divided that story into two parts. There's no scholarly consensus on construction of this narrative. Well, how did this story come to be, in other words? The simple answer is we really don't know for sure. There were probably, though, several earlier sources that came together in a final edited volume, which is the text that we have received. And it's probably part of a Deuteronomic history. Well, what's Deuteronomic history mean? There were probably the book of Judges and Samuel and Kings and the certain elements of the Torah, the books of Moses that are called the first 5 books of the Bible, have a particular point of view, and that is faithfulness brings success and unfaithfulness brings failure. And so this Deuteronomic history may have been written, and we don't know this for sure, much later than the period that we're talking about, to convey a particular understanding of history. Now remember, throughout the history of Israel, there were times of great victory and abundance, and times of great failure and being conquered. The most notable of which, of course, is the Babylonian exile, when Jerusalem was totally destroyed, and the people of Israel were taken into captivity. And so the final version of this text may date to around the time of the Babylonian exile, or a little bit before, perhaps during the time of King Josiah. But the stories that we're talking about actually would have occurred around 1100 BCE, before the Common Era, which puts it in the Iron Age. And that is the time that we think David would have lived. But the Deuteronomic history would have been reliant probably on earlier sources, much closer to the events described. But just another word on the Deuteronomic history. If you want to know sort of the theory of the theology and the theory of history that the Deuteronomist writer has, you can just look at the 28th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy, for example. All of these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you if you obey the Lord your God. Blessed shall you be in the city, blessed shall you be in the field, blessed shall be the fruit of your womb, the fruit of your ground, the fruit of your livestock, both the increase of your cattle and the issue of your flock, But if you will not obey the Lord your God by diligently observing all his commandments and decrees, which I am commanding you today, then all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. Cursed shall you be in the city, cursed shall you be in the field, cursed shall be your basket and your kneading bowl. Cursed shall be the fruit of your womb, the fruit of your ground, the increase of your cattle, and the issue of your flock. So in other words, if you obey all the laws of the Lord, if you worship the Lord, particularly in the centralized place of Jerusalem in the temple, then you'll be blessed. But when you get into trouble is when you start departing from the way of the Lord, departing from the law. If you depart from the commands that the Lord gives you, things aren't going to go well for you, because the Lord has a certain plan for the world. And if you follow those rules, if you follow his commands, then all will be well with you. But if you don't, then things are going to fall apart. So that is the viewpoint of the Deuteronomist writer. And so what the writer of the Deuteronomic history tells us is, here's an example of history of how this actually works out. So even though there probably were many sources that the writer of 1st and 2nd Samuel had at his disposal, because we can't know about those sources, it's probably better to take a look at not so much at the sources, but on the final form of the book that was composed by the later author, who presents us a narrative history. In other words, this is a beautifully crafted story with wonderful prose and poetry as part of it, great dramatic scenes, conflict, resolution, soaring victory and crashing defeat. All of these things are part of this wonderful story of the books of Samuel. And so let's just enjoy the story for what it is and let it challenge us as well, rather than trying to pick it apart in a way that we can't really ultimately determine anyhow. So although this story was probably written several hundred years later, perhaps in the 600s before the Common Era, the 500s before the Common Era, in its final form, it tells us the story way back in about 1,000 years before Christ, and it's telling us the story of this charismatic figure named King David, who has captured and inspired the imagination of both religious people and artists and writers throughout history. And so with this background, we now will be moving into the discussion that transpired based on some of the early parts of 2nd Samuel that we had this past Sunday at St. John's. And so now we will move into the parish hall at St. John's Cathedral for the rest of our conversation. Thank you for joining us this morning. And this is from the very beginning of 2nd Samuel, chapter 1. After the death of Saul, when David had returned from defeating the Amalekites, David remained 2 days in Ziklag, and on the 3rd day a man came from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. When he came to David, he fell to the ground and did obeisance, and David said to him, "Where have you come from?" He said to him, "I have escaped from the camp of Israel." David said to him, "How did things go? Tell me." He answered, "The army fled from the battle, but also many of the army fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan also died." Then David asked the young man who was reporting to him, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan died?" The young man reporting to him said, "I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear while the chariots and the horsemen drew close to him. And when he looked behind him, he saw me, and he called to me, and I answered, 'Here, sir.' And he said to me, 'Who are you?' And I answered, 'I am an Amalekite.' He said to me, "Come, stand over me and kill me, for convulsions have seized me, yet my life still lingers." So I stood over him, and I killed him, for I knew that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the armlet that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to you, my Lord. Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and all the men who were with him did the same. And they mourned and they wept and they fasted until evening for Saul and for his son Jonathan, for the army of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. And David said to the young man who had reported him, "Where do you come from?" And he answered, "I am the son of a resident alien, an Amalekite." David said to him, "Were you not afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" Then David called one of his young men and he said, "Come here and strike him down." So he struck him down and he died. And David said to him, "Your blood be on your head, for your own mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed." Now I'm going to read from the King James Version, the lamentation of David, because this is one of the greatest poems in the English language, I think, in my humble opinion. And David lamented with his lamentation over Saul. I'm sorry. Yes, thank you. And David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and over Jonathan, his son. Also, he bade them teach their children of Judah and use the song of the bow. Behold, it is written in the book of Jasher. The beauty of Israel is slain upon the high places. How are the mighty fallen? Tell it not in Gath, publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised triumph. Ye mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew, neither let there be rain upon you, nor fields of offerings. For there the shield of the mighty is vilely cast away, the shield of Saul, as though he had not been anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty. Saul and Jonathan were lovely and pleasant in their lives, and in their death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. Ye daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in scarlet with other delights, who put on ornaments of gold upon your apparel. How are the mighty fallen in the midst of battle? O Jonathan, thou wast slain in the high places. I am distressed for thee, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant hast thou been unto me. Thy love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. How are the mighty fallen, and the weapons of war perished? So this is the lament that David sings over the death of Saul and Jonathan. And it's a public lament on one level, right? I mean, he says, teach your children this song. And it appears in this particular book, the book of Jasher. Nobody knows what that is, but it's recorded there, right? And so this is the guy that tried to kill him, and yet he now takes up his royal mantle as king, because he has a bigger job now, and that job is to lament over his predecessor, right? and to become a king, to live into his kingship. And so he does this public lament, and But then he turns it personally then. And he says, Jonathan lies upon your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Greatly beloved were you to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. Now, of course, in contemporary times, some folks have argued that perhaps this indicates a relationship between Jonathan and David that might have been a romantic relationship, right? The text tells us neither if it was or it wasn't. There is no way that we can say that about the text, but it doesn't say that it couldn't have been the case as well, right? So that's something that in our contemporary times has emerged from the text out of people's experience to maybe see themselves within that text of the love of these two people as a deeply romantic bond, to the point that Jonathan cedes his claim to the throne in honor of his beloved Jonathan. Kim.
But yet David was married to several women.
Right. So I think the idea there is that David could have been, if one takes that argument, and I'm not saying that it's true or it's not true, that he could have also had this relationship with Jonathan, and maybe he was bisexual or whatever it would be, right? So that is a claim that sometimes is made in our contemporary time about this story. But the idea here, I think, is that it moves from this public lament to a personal one. That this battle of Gilboa, in which Saul and Jonathan are killed, is not just about war. It's about the fact that these two people, father and son, who died together, had a deeply personal bond for David. So we see both in this, that David the warrior and then David's own personal grief in this context. Any other any insights about any of this at this time? Could you speak up a little bit?
Yes.
Please? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, it means the Testament says I guess that's what Jesus came to say. It's just
Right. So the question, if it wasn't clear to folks at home, was that the Old Testament seems like there's lots of violence in it, and how do we address that issue of the violence of the Hebrew Bible? And when in the coming of Jesus, do we see something different than that? Right. Well, here's the story about buying into empire. Remember that and I'm talking about this particular story, these particular stories now. Samuel said, you don't really want a king because the king is going to get you into trouble, right? So the sense of war and warfare and kings fighting each other for power, that is something that goes on in the world, right? And as Father Dan famously said a couple months ago in a sermon, that's the theology of it is what it is. There's no change. That's the way the world works, right? And so in that sense, perhaps the biblical story is real life. It's the way the world is, right? At the same time, I think and I will take exception to the idea that the Old Testament is like that. The Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible, does give us a law that God gives that is based in creation, based in the goodness of humankind, that in our relation and shalom. That is, the well-being of the planet, of human beings in relationship to one another, and human beings in their relationship to God. That's the vision of Eden, right? And much of the Hebrew Bible, it demonstrates how when we disturbed that balance, what results in human history. So we see that in and remember, that the New Testament, the historical location of the New Testament is less than a century. The Hebrew Bible is thousands of years, right, of human interaction with one another, and it's on a much more global scale than what we see in the New Testament, the story of Jesus, right? But yes, you're right. The disturbance that you feel is what I was talking about at the beginning, right? There are texts of terror in here, right? And how do we grapple with those? Because they're all part of the Bible. There was a heretic by the name of Marcion in the early church, and he said, well, we just got to get rid of the Old Testament. And that's not what the church said. No, this is the text that we have received. The good, the bad, and the ugly. And a lot of it is about human beings dealing with each other in sometimes violent ways and sometimes magnificent ways, and yet it's all there, right? Yeah, that's right. The disciples were operating out of the logic of empire, which is peace through violence, right? Right, exactly. We still have that, right? So that's why stories like this are important for us, because we can grapple with them. Now this is like what we can say. This is not unlike what we've experienced in other times in our own culture, maybe, right? So yeah, to move ahead several centuries to the time of Jesus, the famous Pax Romana of the Roman Empire was peace through violence. That was if you want to read something about that, the wonderful Roman historian Mary Beard talks about that Julius Caesar's Gallic campaign to civilize the Gauls in Western Europe, that attempt at pacification was attempt to conquer them so that they would be peaceful, not by trying to gain peace by any other means. So this is the logic of empire, and it's not distinct to this period in biblical history, but it is distinct to human history. And if we want to bring the gospel into it, we can say that the whole point of the kingdom of God is to reverse the tide of human imperial history and to tell a different history, a different story. But that's not just Jesus. That appears, Jesus is the next chapter and an entire story of the people of God dating back from the very beginning. So that, I think, is something that we might want to keep in mind about that. But that's an excellent question. Yeah, Felicia.
I also thought that if the Old Testament had not had all of that violence in it, nobody would have taken it seriously, because God was dealing within the context of a very violent world. And how can you say, don't do this, and have other people understand, I really mean don't do this, if there are no extreme consequences? Everyone else on earth was experiencing extreme consequences. I mean, it's a book in context for its time, that was common for the time. And even though there are times of violence in the Old Testament, it was still, in many cases, not as violent as some of the other religions that were around. religions that were practicing human sacrifice on a regular basis,
Mhm.
you know, religions that were doing all kinds of things. In the context of when it existed, it wasn't particularly right.
Right, and I think we also, to that point, have to recall that although this is written about the year 1000, it's the topic is the beginning of the Davidic monarchy. This story doesn't get to us for another several hundred years, right? To the 7th or the 6th century, either in the reign of King Josiah or in the time of the exile. And it's trying to reflect on where did we go wrong? You know, and it's really telling a story. One of the ways we went wrong is part of the story is that we wanted to be like all the other kingdoms of the world, and look where it got us, right? So that's another element of what's going on here, right? And at the same time, it looks back to David as sort of like the golden age of the monarchy, David and his son Solomon. We're not going to get into Solomon, of course, in these sessions, but Solomon comes to the throne in equally intriguing ways. His mother is none other than Bathsheba, who does appear in 2 Samuel, and she's the one who really manipulates David to put him on the throne rather than the rightful heir, who's supposed to be Adonijah, his older brother. And Adonijah, and we're moving ahead now into 1 Kings, but Adonijah is having a coronation festival for himself. And at the same time, Bathsheba goes and says, remember you promised that my son Solomon was going to be king. And if you let this happen, your authority no longer exists. And so Saul, I'm sorry, Saul, might as well be Saul. David names his son Solomon to be his successor. And so he's, you know, nobody else is going to say who the king of Israel is going to be. I'm going to name the king of Israel. And so he names Solomon, and then Nathan, the prophet, and Zadok, the priest, anoints him, and Solomon becomes king. But that's the end of the story. And this is you know what Alter was talking about at the end. You know, that the final sort of decline of this person, David, into his old age when he can hardly get out of bed. So it's the whole story from this boy shepherd through his rise to power and through his inevitable human decline. So he becomes an almost pathetic, powerless character on his deathbed. So this is the story of 2 Samuel, and it's a very human story, and in the coming weeks, we are going to be treated, you know, first of all by Robert Alter, looking at those, and I would recommend that. Well, I would recommend that you read all of 2 Samuel, because we're not going to be doing a play-by-play on this, but definitely for next week, please read chapters 11 and 12 of 2 Samuel. So we'll have Robert Alter next week. As I said, we're going to have Aaron Darby come and talk about the archaeology of ancient Jerusalem, and from somebody who spends a lot of time doing the archaeology of ancient Jerusalem, and that will be another wonderful lecture, I think. Then Professor Stussy is going to be focusing on the women in 2 Samuel, but particularly Michal, as the daughter of Saul, who becomes the wife of David, by another very poignant story. It is determined that Saul's daughter Michal should be the wife of David. It is determined, right? But she's unfortunately already married she has another husband. But one of David's thugs comes and gets Michal, takes her from her husband. And the story tells us that her husband follows along behind, calling out after her. And the thug gets in the way and says, "Go back home." And he goes back home. And his wife is taken from him and given to David because it makes a important political alliance. So we have that story. And Professor Stussy is going to talk about that story and perhaps some other places about women in the Bible. Then we have Stephen Mackenzie, who will conclude our time together from his wonderful book by Oxford Press called David, a Biography. And so he will be more giving us the arc of the whole story to conclude our time together. So those are our four different presenters. The week that we will not meet is the week of the 27th of June, the last Sunday in June. It's also our Sunday where we do Gay Pride celebration, and so we're having a big lunch, and so we'll take a break from that day. We don't have any speakers on that day. But the rest of the Sundays, we will have these speakers, and then I think there's one Sunday in there where you get me again for a much lesser luminary, a minor prophet, to lead the class. But before we conclude today, other observations, maybe from some of the folks who are viewing digitally, if you have any thoughts or comments that you'd like to add.
Hello?
Hello, Margaret.
Hi.
Margaret, we can't hear you for some reason.
Really? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I've never liked David. I've always seen him as a thug. But to see the progression from the child, and then he becomes a shepherd, then he kills Goliath, and then he grows up and becomes best friend to Jonathan, and then Saul is out to kill him because he's jealous, and then he becomes king, and he's just this thug. He's no different from Saul, yet God loves him. So what is that?
Well, that's one of those questions, isn't it? That the text doesn't really answer for us.
Yeah.
We see that often in the Bible, don't we? Where someone like David is a man after God's own heart, as the text literally says, or in the end, man God exalted. And yet, he doesn't seem much better than Saul in many ways. Although he is a fervent lover of God.
Yeah. I've always wondered about that David did all these things. He coveted two men's wives. And he did all these things, and yet God loved him. I've always wondered about that. Can you hear me? Oh, okay.
God tends to call people who whoops, I got a little feedback here. God tends to call people who are amazingly flawed, and sometimes more than flawed, Uh, and yet, that's what the text tells us, right? So we have to grapple with that. You know, in some ways, I guess the question might be, you know, how is it that the providence of the divine works through human history with all of our failings and sometimes downright evil ways, and yet somehow God tends to work his purposes or God's purposes out somehow through all of that, through human beings. I'm reminded of a story of a priest I know, older priest, a long time ago, and one of his parishioners was complaining about the quality of the clergy. And his response was, I agree, the quality of the clergy is very bad, except that God has only the laity to choose from. And I think that's maybe we can see that in the broader context, right? I mean, that God has only humanity to work through, right? And so that I think is maybe it's not an answer to your question, Margaret, but there's this sort of inscrutability. We're thrown back maybe to the book of Job, where at the end of Job,
just thinking that.
God says to Job, "Who are you? You know, where were you when I created all of these things?" Now, there's other problems with the book of Job, but there's a certain inscrutability in the ways of the divine, and remember, much of the Old Testament, the Bible, the Old Testament of the Bible, Hebrew scriptures that we have received comes to us primarily out of the experience of exile, when the people of Israel their city is utterly destroyed, the temple is destroyed, their children are killed. Most of them are taken up lock, stock, and barrel and moved from their homeland to a totally foreign place. The Bible, as we have it, emerges out of that experience of utter loss, and they're trying to make sense out of that. So even though there are much older traditions that are woven together into the scriptures, most of what we have in the Bible in its final form comes out of that experience of total loss. What happened? How could this happen to us? We're God's chosen people. How could this happen to us? And there's lots of the Bible tries to grapple with that very human question of how can we move from this place of utter abandonment and grief to someplace new? And that's one of the main questions that the Old Testament is trying to answer, to create a new identity. Yeah, Felicia.
Well, in the example that you're talking about, when they came into exile, it wasn't like there was no reason for the exile. I mean, it wasn't like Israel had been doing everything that they were supposed to do, which is one of the reasons why the exile takes place. And even within that, there are people amongst them who are faithful, trying to bring back. One of the books I love the most is the book of Nehemiah, and that's the restoration of Israel. And Nehemiah and Ezra worked together to restore Israel, to rebuild the walls, to get things back together. Well, that whole thing takes place in the context of being in exile. So it's not like they were forgotten. It's just there was a period where judgment took place that allowed that to happen, but he never abandoned it. So I didn't really see that as grappling with the abandonment of God. There was reasons.
You're speaking like the true Deuteronomist historian. That's the theory that the Deuteronomist would say. You know, now if we have the book of Ecclesiastes, tells us a different story. There's nothing new under the sun. You know, there is death and there's life, there's war and there's peace. So enjoy all your days. Enjoy the fruit of your labor. Bounce your grandchildren on your knee. Because that's, if you can enjoy life, do it. That's Ecclesiastes' answer to the problem. What's that? Right. That's the version of history that that Ecclesiastes gives us, right? So the Old Testament answer, that one answer is that you get, right? But there are other answers too. You know, that there is no answer, to all of this. Even Job, when he has this epiphany of God saying to him, "Were you there when I did this?" Basically just trust my providence. One still is left at the end of the book of Job with the idea of, who is this God who sort of asserts his power in this way? Well, we can't get into all the book of Job right now, but Job basically just is silent, and one wonders if his silence is submission or defeat. So again, I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying, but the Hebrew Bible wonderfully gives us other conversation partners about that, other ways to grapple with some of these questions. This is a wonderful book in that regard, I think, and meaning the entire thing, right? There are so many voices that are in conversation with each other, so I think that the next several weeks, I think, are going to be very fruitful in terms of looking some of the particulars. Again, as we conclude, try if you can to read all of 2 Samuel. Read both 1st and 2 Samuel if you can. You get the whole arc of the story. And Robert Alter says you should, if you're going to do that, you should also read the first 2 chapters of the Book of Kings, because he thinks they kind of fold in there, right? So do that if you can, and read the whole arc of the story, because we're not going to be able to take it piece by piece. As I said, we're going to be looking at stories and elements of stories and archaeology and that sort of thing. So I think this is going to be a hopefully challenging and provocative, I believe, class over the next several weeks, exploring this person who despite all of his tragic failures, is also understood as the king that is looked to for all the Israel of this, the history of Israel, and also who the New Testament holds up as Jesus being his son, the son of David. In fact, as he enters Jerusalem, what do they say? Blessed is he, blessed is the King of Israel, Hosanna to the Son of David, the King of Israel. Right. So even there, David appears, and Jesus as the successor of this man.
Yeah.
In all of his tragic flaws. Right.
Father Mark,
You have a final question there?
this is Martha Watson.
Speak up, please.
Can you hear me?
About Jesus. That's not what Jesus said about himself. Because Jesus constantly talks about the fact that my kingdom is not of this world. He's constantly making that statement. People want him to be David. They want that desperately, which is one of the reasons Judas betrayed him, because he thought he could get this party started and then get, lose and we defeat the Romans. That's what humans thought about Christ. That is not what Christ portrayed himself as.
That's right. And yet he is the son of, according to Matthew in particular, he is the son of David, right? He comes from the line and lineage of David, right? So he is, that's right. He is, according to the New Testament, the king of Israel, in that he comes out of the line of David.
Father Mark, can you hear me? This is Martha Watson.
Oh, yes, Martha.
I have a comment. When you
Martha, could you please speak up?
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. My thoughts when you were talking about David has been, given that all of us as human beings have to deal with our imperfections, because we all have them, whether we acknowledge it or not. And as you're talking about David, I think about the struggles a lot of people have with Thomas Jefferson, one of the most important people in terms of the Declaration of Independence and our Constitution, yet he had slaves. Then he had illicit relationships with one of his slaves. And how are we trying to place him in American history at this point? And I think it's something we have to grapple with in any society, with our society, but also with ourselves as members of that society.
Thank you, Martha. Yeah, that I think is an important acknowledgement. I think that you're making that analogy, I think is apt. I think this is, unless there's any other, yes, ma'am.
I know I said this in my sermon.
Could you speak up though, Deacon Margaret, please?
I know I said this in my sermon, so it's not a commercial interruption, but David was not perfect,
Yes.
but he was God's perfect choice.
Which, yeah, yes. I mean, and when you said that in your sermon, and as you're right, you know, he is God's perfect choice, right? For whatever reason, but which makes it even more problematic, right? Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, you're right.
So Thomas Jefferson was perfect for the Declaration of Independence, but he was not too good for slavery, was it?
I can't hear Deacon Margaret.
Margaret said that he was perfect for the, Thomas Jefferson, by analogy, was perfect for the US Constitution, but he was not perfect with regard to American slavery.
Oh, I agree, but David also had those imperfections, and we all have those imperfections
Well,
that we have to look at.
he had more than imperfections.
Yeah, but it's there, and I think that's part of the emergence of the Old Testament, is that you're not getting clear answers. It's not black and white, and that's our struggle as people.
Yes, right. So I think these are all the things that I think that we can grapple with or struggle with as we engage in courageous Bible study. And otherwise, we aren't taking the text, we are not giving the text the respect and the seriousness that it needs to be taken with. If we whitewash it, as it were. So look forward to the coming weeks, and thank you all for being here today. This is fun having everybody here and all of you at home and anybody who might be. One final thing, is there anything in chat that needs to be said, Kelsey, or reflected on? All right. Okay.
I just think there are issues with the auditory.
That.
I had problems with hearing.
Okay, so next
The
week,
auditory
we can
problems.
really work on that maybe a little. Thank you though, Martha, for that. And anyone viewing digitally, please contact us either during the week or in the chat to let us know what your difficulties were so we can try to correct them next week. Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.
Thanks.